All right, Rupert Sheldrake, what an honor it is to have you on the podcast again.
It's very good to be with you.
I'm a huge fan of your work ever since I discovered your band TED Talk way back in, I think, 2013. And I think you're doing an incredible service by exploring the spiritual world and the scientific world and merging those two together. I don't know many other scientists that are doing that.
Well, I do it because they're both things of great interest to me, and it's just how my life works. So it's not as if I deliberately created a kind of mission, it's just evolved that way.
Well, it seems like academic science and institutions have become kind of afraid to dip their toes into the spiritual. Anything that's like considered woo woo will destroy your career. I don't know.
Well, I think that's the case. I think there's a taboo against anything spiritual within the academic or secular world. Um, it's there for historical reasons, but it's partly because the prevailing worldview in the academic world is mechanistic materialism. And materialism is inherently atheistic. So the secular default position is atheism. And if people have spiritual or religious views, then they're treated as something a bit like a personal hobby, a bit like breeding gerbils or something. It's a completely personal hobby and not something you talk about in public. So that's the usual culture in the scientific world. And of course, plenty of scientists do have spiritual experiences and spiritual practices, but they just don't talk about them.
Yeah, there's a lot of fear in the academic world because there's so much funding involved, and but I think that almost everyone I talk to feels that there's something deeper going on in the universe. There's more than just the material, physical things that we can see with our five senses and measure. There's definitely a lot more going on.
Well, that's what most human beings have thought throughout most of human history. So it's actually a majority view. What's a minority view is this kind of stripped down, mechanistic, materialist view that the universe is unconscious, matter is the only reality, consciousness is confined to human brains and maybe the brains of other animals, and nothing has any point. I mean, that's a very eccentric view by historical standards.
So in public, these scientists, they have to like shame you and distance themselves from you, but probably in private, they're like, wow, I really relate to everything you're saying.
Oh, that happens all the time. I have a lot of scientific friends, and whenever I give talks at scientific institutions, people come up to me afterwards and are very, very friendly and often say, I've had all sorts of experiences I can't explain, and psychic experiences and spiritual experiences, but I can't tell my colleagues about it. So they definitely, this is something that's quite widespread in the scientific community. It's just that people don't talk about it. They're in the closet. It's a bit like gays in the 1950s.
So what do you think science, the curiosity of science exploration in academia, what has it lost by rejecting this spiritual side?
Well, I don't think it's lost much in the realms of sort of engineering and, sort of organic chemistry and that kind of thing. But I think it's lost a great deal when it comes to understanding consciousness. I mean, consciousness is treated in the academic world as if it's just a product of brain activity and nothing more. And the so-called hard problem of consciousness is that you can't get from brain scans and neuroscience and EEG measurements and so on to consciousness. All you get is measurements and scans on bits of paper and so on. It doesn't tell you what consciousness is, or it doesn't tell you about the actual experience of consciousness. But there has been some advance in the last 30 years through the development of consciousness studies. And now in some universities, in some departments, it's actually transdisciplinary consciousness studies, which includes studies of near-death experiences, of lucid dreams, of psychedelic experiences, mystical experiences. So these things are now actually being studied by neurophysiologists, philosophers, anthropologists in this transdisciplinary field. The Journal of Consciousness Studies was started in 1994, so it's just over 30 years. This has been a kind of visible part of the academic world. And the Tucson conferences at the University of Arizona towards the science of consciousness have been going on a similar length of time. They still go on every 2 years in Arizona. And then there's one in Europe in alternate years. This year, 2025, it's in Barcelona, Spain. So there are people in the academic world engaged in these fields and in discussing them, but they're still quite a small minority. And most undergraduate teaching departments don't cover this field at all.
I remember on the same night that you gave your TED Talk that famously got banned, Graham Hancock also gave a TED Talk that kind of got banned. I'm not sure if it got banned, but there was a lot of controversy around it. But I remember in that TED Talk, he said that consciousness is seen in two different ways. Either you look at the brain as like a generator, and when the generator is broken, that's the end of consciousness, or you look at consciousness more as like a frequency or like a radio wave, and our brain has like an antenna that taps into the frequency. And even if the radio or the brain gets destroyed, that frequency is still going on. I have a feeling of what camp you might fall into, but...
Yes, well, I mean, I certainly agree with that idea that our brains are receivers of consciousness, not generators of consciousness. And I think that the main interface between consciousness and the brain is through fields. I mean, fields are extended patterns of influence. And we know that the brain is influenced by electromagnetic fields and indeed produces them. And when you have an electroencephalograph reading, you put electrodes on the skull, and what they're actually measuring is the electrical field and the waves of activity in the electrical field in the brain. The electrical field penetrates the skull, and fields are automatically extended and integrative. They bring everything together in connecting it all together. So I think that what we're dealing with is fields, fields interacting with the brain and extending beyond the brain.
Yes, that totally resonates. And I loved our collaboration about how the mind extends beyond the brain. And you showed that our visual field can kind of touch people, even when they're not, it's that sense of being stared at.
Exactly. I mean, that's the easiest way to understand this idea is through vision. Because, we're producing these images all the time. Every time we see something, we're seeing images. And as I said in that talk, which you so very well animated, then those images, I think, are where they seem to be. They're in our minds, but they're not inside our brains. Like my image of you right now is on a computer screen about 2 feet in front of me. I don't think my image of you, Mark, is inside my brain. I think it's on the screen where it seems to be. And therefore my visual field is projecting out your image and projecting out the image of everything around me.
Yeah, that definitely resonates. And I think this brings me neatly along to my first question for you is it possible to manipulate matter with the mind?
Well, the answer has to be yes, because just in the simple, almost trivial sense that everything we think, the simplest thing, raising my hand, is manipulating matter with my mind. Every time I speak, everything I do is controlled by my mind, if it's consciously going on or even unconsciously going on. I mean, my habits are unconscious, and yet they involve the mind controlling the body. So this is happening all the time. Our minds are interacting with our brains and our bodies all the time, and influencing what happens. And what happens in my body is material. The body's measurable, has weight, is a material object. So in a sense, this is so simple. It's obvious that it must be happening. Now, and there's a trivial sense or simple sense in which I can influence things at a distance. I can pick up the telephone and ring someone up, and it rings in their house, they pick it up. I'm influencing them through my intention to contact them. So everyone would agree about that. I mean, that's not controversial. So, in fact, if you look around us, we live in cities or towns, and all the buildings are produced, first of all, in people's minds, in the minds of architects, and in the minds of developers, and in the minds of bankers who provide the finance for them. So, every machine we have around us, every computer, every smartphone, every book, influences of minds on matter. We live in a world that's actually shaped by human minds, except if we go into wild nature where hardly any humans been before and where they've hardly impacted the environment. But here in Britain, which has been an agricultural country for 5,000 years, when you look at the countryside, there are fields, there are hedges and stuff. Everything about the landscape has been shaped by human minds and human culture.
Yeah, I don't think anybody would dispute that. I guess
No.
I'm thinking about the more sensational, maybe sci-fi ideas of somebody using their mind and lifting up a giant boulder, or the things we see in movies. Is there any legitimacy to telekinesis?
Well, there's two areas where it's been investigated. I mean, I don't think anyone's lifted up giant boulders with it. I mean, there are people who claim that the pyramids were built by people having mental powers and able to move huge blocks of stone. But, I'd be more convinced by those claims if someone could actually show it happening right now. I think the two areas which are sometimes called micro PK and macro PK, PK being psychokinesis or telekinesis, mind over matter effects. There's one area of research where people influence random event generators with the mind, and I think there's reasonable evidence that people can produce small deviations from randomness in random event generators. This was work that was done at the Princeton Engineering Anomalies Laboratory. It's been done by various people around the world. And it's not terribly reliable. I mean, it's not something that happens every time. I mean, no one's yet developed a device where you can open your garage door by the power of the mind, for example, as you glide up to it in your car. So it's not something that's sort of easily repeatable and reliable. And the other thing is poltergeist activities, where people who are mentally disturbed, often adolescents with mental disturbances, seem to cause unconsciously, heavy objects to move around, bits of furniture to move around, objects to fly around in rooms. Now, that's the problem with that is that it is unconscious and uncontrollable. I mean, there's not many people can do that at will, if anyone can. This is an area where no one really has very clear-cut, repeatable results. I think the evidence suggests it can happen, but it's not happening in a way that you can apply it and turn it into a sort of, as I say, things like garage door opening devices. So for me, I talk out really the really big question is how our minds influence our bodies. I mean, because that's, as we agree, everyone agrees minds can influence bodies, and everyone agrees that the world we live in is shaped by human minds, and nobody knows how.
Yeah, I'm thinking of, have you heard of Dr. Joe Dispenza?
Yes.
Yes, that's the bulk of his research is about how kind of like your health starts with your mind, and every thought that you have is like a placebo or a nocebo. A negative thought is a nocebo and a positive thought is a placebo, and it's amazing how powerful the placebo effect is.
It is indeed, but that again is a case of mind-body interaction. In a sense, in principle, it's not very different from, raising your arm or writing something or saying a word. The mind's influencing the body. And we know that the mind can influence the unconscious processes in the body through hypnosis. I've seen demonstrations myself, you may have seen them too, where, for example, in one demonstration, a hypnotist, is when I was at Cambridge, one of the professors there was a hypnotist in the medical faculty. He hypnotized a medical student and said that he'd got a pencil or a pen, and he took the pen and he said, this is a lighted cigarette, and I'm putting it on your arm, and he put it on the person's arm, and a blister appeared, exactly as it would do if it really had been a lighted cigarette. Now, that kind of thing is a mind over matter effect, and it was quite unconscious. The person who was hypnotized didn't know that this was going to be produced by the hypnosis, and even if they'd consciously wanted to produce a blister there, they wouldn't have been able to. So there's the powers of the unconscious mind and the conscious mind to influence the body are very great, and the placebo effect is a demonstration of that. People, if they think they're going to get better and hope they're going to get better, often do, which is why in drug trials they always have to include a placebo.
That is crazy that he actually got a blister.
Yes. I mean, this is well established, and it's also well established that you can get warts to disappear by charming them. There's all sorts of wart charming methods, and all sorts of folklore about them. You hit them with a Bible, absorb them with a potato and bury the potato. There's endless methods for getting rid of warts, part of folklore, and many of them work, at least some of the time. So all of these show that our minds can influence our bodies unconsciously. And where this goes furthest, really, I think, is in India, where yogis can achieve an extraordinary control over the autonomic nervous system. Normally, the internal nervous system, the sympathetic and the parasympathetic nervous system, isn't under much conscious control. We don't consciously control the peristalsis, the waves that pass through our intestines. We're not conscious most of the time of our heartbeat and our breathing. And of course we can control our breath consciously up to a point, and pranayama, breathing practices, are all based on controlling the breath. And we can, through biofeedback, learn to control our heartbeat, which we don't normally. It normally responds to our emotions and our activities automatically. But yogis are able to achieve an extraordinary degree of control over their internal organs and their physiological systems, partly through breath, because breath is like breathing is the interface. Because it normally happens unconsciously, we go on breathing when we're asleep, and you and I are breathing now without most of the time thinking about it. It's part of an automatic system, but you can also control it consciously up to a point. You can hold your breath. You can, in free diving, people learn to control their breath to quite a strong degree. And through the breath, it's an interface where the conscious mind can interface with the unconscious autonomic system. And yogis are able to achieve this control through practice and feedback, largely through breathing, using that as the interface.
That makes total sense. Yeah. And back to the wart thing, you just reminded me of when my dad was a little kid. He told me about how the doctor would take a magic marker and draw a circle around all his warts. And they told him it was a magic medical marker and that they would all go away in a week. And they did go away in a week. And then, I don't know, a year later, he went to the doctor and he said, "What kind of medicine was that?" And they were like, "Oh, that was just a regular marker." And I think once that illusion was broken, maybe some of the warts came back. You got to keep the illusion going.
Yes.
Yeah, the power of belief.
Exactly. Well, you see, regular medicine, normally people portray it as, placebo-controlled drug trials. The placebo has quite a big effect, and for a drug to be approved, it has to have a bigger effect than the placebo. And a lot of people say, oh, well, homeopathy doesn't work, and all these alternative medicine things are just make-believe because it's nothing but the placebo effect. But the fact is, the placebo effect works, at least some of the time. And so a homeopathic remedy, even if it's just placebo effect, is better than nothing. Most people assume that if it's a placebo effect, it's nothing. It isn't nothing. We have latent healing powers which the placebo effect can unleash, and they are genuinely healing.
Yes, and I'd like to talk about morphic resonance, if we could.
Yeah.
It's been 50 years since you first came up with that hypothesis? Has it been 50 years? Yeah, wow.
Well, I first thought of it in 1973 when I was working in Cambridge. I didn't publish it till 1981 in my first book, A New Science of Life. So it's over 50 years since I first thought of the idea.
So at the time when you came up with the idea, was it just like heresy? Was it met with just tons of backlash?
Well, certainly when I first published it in 1981, there was a huge backlash. I mean, there was a very mixed reception. When I published my book, A New Science of Life, some people loved it. I mean, the New Scientist magazine in Britain ran a whole special feature on it. They said this was fascinating. A lot of scientists said it was an immensely stimulating hypothesis and so forth. But after 3 months or so, there was a big backlash from the journal Nature. The editor of Nature, Sir John Maddox, was a militant materialist, particularly a militant atheist, and he found this idea very offensive. And he wrote a famous editorial called A Book for Burning, and created an enormous backlash against it, which still echoes on because in the so-called skeptical community, people who are not real skeptics, but they're defenders of the materialist worldview, they're kind of ideological skeptics. They have organizations like the Committee for Skeptical Inquiry, and they have a group, the Guerrilla Skeptics on Wikipedia, and other independent skeptics, who've captured whole sections of Wikipedia, anything to do with telepathy, psychokinesis, precognition, psychic phenomena, and the biographies of people like me. I mean, they've controlled my biography page for at least 15 years. And so they try to portray me as a pseudoscientist and morphic resonance as pseudoscience and so on. So this backlash continues to this day. And if you look at the references that they cite, then they're still citing Sir John Maddox's denunciation of my work in 1981, in his Book for Burning editorial. So this was not just something that happened as a historical blip, it's something which is still kept current by this organized skeptical movement, and particularly in Wikipedia, which is where they have the most influence at the moment. They're not very influential in the way they used to be in most other areas, but they're still, they hang on, they're controlling from behind the scenes large chunks of Wikipedia.
Yeah, it's crazy. I was just before this conversation, I don't know why, I just decided to look up your name on Google, and I clicked Wikipedia first, and it was atrocious what they were, if you just didn't know anything about you and you only read the Wikipedia, you would think that you were like this mad scientist that was trying to destroy things. But, if I talk to normal everyday people, I say, oh, I'm having Rupert Sheldrake on today. They say, oh, great. I love his work. It's so inspiring. It's a very different picture.
It's a very different picture, and it's one that they very deliberately construct to put me in the worst possible light. And the effect it has really is that if journalists hear anything about my work, the first thing they do is look up Wikipedia. Then it says I'm controversial, I'm a pseudoscientist and stuff. So they back off. So that's why there's very little about my work in mainstream media, because it's too dangerous for journalists to tackle it. And so the guerrilla skeptics are extremely effective. They work behind the scenes. I mean, they break all the rules of Wikipedia. You're not supposed to have secret cabals, people working together, editing together. but they boast of the fact they have secret cabals and they work together and they train up people to work with them. And they're not the only committed skeptics editing Wikipedia. There's a number of other people. But what drives them really is not a belief in science through curiosity about science, but by a conviction that mechanistic materialism is the only true worldview. And what makes people so committed to that and get so angry when anyone goes against it is usually because they've made this part of a kind of atheist worldview, a persona for themselves. Their whole identity depends on rejecting spirituality and religion, saying those are just for feeble-minded, stupid people, and they're really smart, they've risen above it, seen through it, etc. Their whole persona and self-identity depends on this worldview, which is based on the mechanistic materialist scientific approach. So that's why they feel it's so important to defend this, and why they see me as such a threat. Because, first of all, I'm trying to provide alternative scientific approaches to materialism, and have been doing for decades. Secondly, I take seriously spiritual experiences and the spiritual realm. So this is simply something that they can't tolerate. They have to brand all this as pseudoscience and me as a pseudoscientist to try and disqualify me from being taken seriously. And they've been very effective. I mean, I can go on with what I do, and in some ways I see this as a blessing because, I get about 10 emails a week inviting me to give talks or interviews or podcasts or go to conferences and this. And if Wikipedia said I was, brilliant and the morphic resonance was a fantastic theory that would change the world and stuff, instead of 10, I'd get 100. I'd be overwhelmed. So actually it's a kind of protective cordon, which means I can lead a quieter and more productive life than I might otherwise do.
Well, the good news is I think this cabal behind Wikipedia is losing power because more and more people are waking up to, they're looking deeper into things and not just taking things at face value. They're questioning things. And so I'm encouraged that I believe these old structures that are very materialistic are starting to crack and crumble a bit.
Well, I think they are, and I think the work you do with After School is part of that process. However, they retain the firmest grip they possibly can on Wikipedia itself. And one of the founders of Wikipedia, Jimmy Wales, is a hardcore dogmatic materialist and supports them. So if they didn't have support from high up in that organization, they wouldn't be so powerful. But they do have support from Jimmy Wales, who is dead against every form of alternative medicine and what he calls woo-woo. So they're able to get away with this.
Yeah, well, so I guess what I was getting at earlier in this question was the morphic resonance 50 years later. Have we come around? Has there been more and more evidence now stacking up saying that there is a lot more than just this material world?
Well, it's a very good question. And, if I to take it as the big picture, the answer is I wish there was more evidence than there is. I've spent all these years trying to get research done on morphic resonance. It's been unbelievably difficult to get anyone to do it within universities or scientific institutions because it's been proclaimed a heresy. Anyone who does it is afraid of losing their job, their grant, being attacked by skeptics and so forth. So it's been extremely difficult to get the work done. I mean, I've tried in many ways to do it. I can't get lab space in universities myself. I mean, I'm able to do research as long as it's field research. But for morphic resonance, which is about memory and nature, to do morphic resonance experiments, you have to compare what happened in the past with what happens now. And to get any convincing evidence, you have to keep the conditions constant, because all sorts of things change in the world. For example, morphic resonance says that it should be getting easier to learn skateboarding or surf or windsurfing or computer programming or to play particular video games. Well, it is getting easier to do all those things. There's a lot of evidence, but it's not the only factor. You know, there is videos, there's improvements in the technology, there's better teaching methods. To tease out morphic resonance from all those things is difficult. There are areas where there is consistent evidence over the years. One area, for example, is in IQ tests. People have been doing very similar IQ tests for more than 100 years. And I predicted in the 1980s that with IQ tests, the scores should be going up. The average scores should be going up, not because people are getting smarter, not because their actual intelligence quotient or IQ is getting higher, but because the tests are getting easier to do because so many people have done the tests. And I couldn't get the data when I tried to look at this in the 1980s, but a psychologist called James Flynn did exactly this analysis shortly after that, and found that all around the world, average scores on IQ have been going up and up since when they first came in 1918. All through the 20th century, these scores were going up and up and up, at least 30% increase in average IQ scores. But no evidence that people are actually 30% smarter. You know, by other criteria, they're not smarter. And so there's been a real problem for conventional psychologists to explain this thing, which is called the Flynn effect. And some have said that it's because, you know, people have had more protein as children, but, you know, that might have applied to Japan, where they had more protein in their diet through the 20th century, but not to America, where lots of people were eating meat all the time through the 20th century. Then some said it was because they were getting smarter because they had more practice with tests, but evidence showed that that wasn't really a very good explanation. Some said they were getting smarter because they'd seen more TV, but the other evidence showed that actually TV tended to have a dumbing down effect. So there's been a long controversy about the nature of the Flynn effect in IQ. And I think that's one example of a morphic resonance effect. I think morphic resonance may also be happening before our very eyes in phenomena like Wordle, the New York Times word puzzle. It's a 5-letter word puzzle. A new puzzle is published every day by the New York Times. And there's a student here in Britain who's been looking into this recently. And one of the anomalous things is that far more people get Wordle right first time every day than you would expect by chance. Why? No one knows why. I mean, this is an ongoing project. She's looking at this as we speak. But this is an area where you can actually do research. In the field, you don't have to have a lab to do research on Wordle, because the New York Times produces something called a Wordle bot every day, which gives in real time updated value on how people are doing in the test as the day goes on, and then the next day there's a new word. So the whole thing's replicated day by day. So that's one promising area for research. But I've now found a new way of doing this research which gets around the taboo in the academic world, which is that there are now companies that do testing, routine testing for corporations, usually for drug companies, sort of outsourced research companies. And I have an experiment starting very soon on morphic resonance in the evolution of antibiotic resistance in E. coli, the bacterium E. coli. I have a funder who's paying for this. I have a lab here in Britain that's where they're planning to do it. They should be starting soon. Of course, I can't foresee what the results will be. I mean, I've designed the experiments, and I hope they'll show a morphic resonance effect, but I can't be sure. The whole point of research is you don't know what's going to happen. You have to wait and see what happens. But this is now the way forward, I think, doing research in commercial laboratories where their motivation is not getting ahead in the academic world, and they simply do a good job. You have a contract, you pay them, and they do the experiment to an agreed design. And that's exactly as I think science should be done. And it's done by technically competent people. And at last I found a way of getting around this taboo. I only discovered this last year, that this was a possible way forward. So I'm actually quite excited about it. So the answer basically in a nutshell is that there's a lot of circumstantial evidence for morphic resonance, some of which I discuss in my books, including the Flynn effect in IQ test scores. But there's been very little actual experimental research because the sociological taboo is so strong within the scientific community. There have, however, been quite a number of tests in human psychology, and I summarize those in the new edition, the third edition of my book, A New Science of Life, which in the US has been retitled Morphic Resonance. There's an appendix there with 10 new tests for morphic resonance and a summary of the research so far. So this is very much an ongoing research program. It's a scientific hypothesis, and it's a testable hypothesis. I think that's what science is meant to be about. One of the problems that skeptics have is that they hate uncertainty. Dogmatic skeptics want to have a worldview that's certain. They're fundamentalists, really. They want certainty. And morphic resonance isn't certain. It's not certain it's true. I've been working on this for decades. I'd love it to be true, but actually I'm not certain it's true. It's a hypothesis, a testable hypothesis. But what the skeptics do is they frame it as a claim, that I'm claiming this is true, and they're going to say, no, it's not. And where's the evidence? I'm not saying it's true. I'm saying it's a possibility. A hypothesis is a possibility. It's possible it's true. If it's true, and if the evidence supports it, it has enormous ramifications and implications through the whole world of nature, of understanding chemical and physical and biological and psychological processes. It says that the so-called laws of nature are more like habits. It has very, very wide-ranging ramifications if it's true, but the key thing is to do the experiments and find out whether this hypothesis is actually supported by them, as the circumstantial evidence appears to support it, but there's not enough evidence yet for anyone, including me, to know.
Wow, I think you found a brilliant way to test this with the E. coli. So the thinking is that if E. coli becomes resistant in one area of the world or in one lab, on the other side of the world, it will suddenly start to become more resistant over there, right?
Yes, and there's already circumstantial evidence that antibiotic resistance, when it's evolved in one place, turns up somewhere else. There's already, in the literature on antibiotic resistance, this is already known. But of course, in the real world, you can't be sure that someone hasn't just flown around the world, carried the resistant germs with them. People working in epidemiology, some of them think there really is something mysterious and unexplained going on. But without specific evidence, you can't be sure. Nevertheless, it's very suggestive, and I think that the evidence makes me think this may well be happening, that once E. coli or any other bacterium has developed antibiotic resistance in one place, it'll be easier to develop it in another place. And morphic resonance, you see, also has implications for epidemiology of diseases like COVID. Morphic resonance would say that if a lot of people recover from a new respiratory infection like COVID, the antibody system is activated, and that might make it easier for other people to activate the antibody system and to overcome the disease. So what this morphic resonance predicts is that virulent new viral diseases will get less virulent over time. Even if you don't have vaccines for them, they'll become, and even if people haven't been vaccinated, they'll get less virulent over time through a kind of morphic resonance effect on the immune system, on the way that people respond to the infection. And that seems to be the case with a lot of respiratory diseases. Flu, colds, COVID keep evolving, and they become much less aggressive, like the famous Asian flu around 1918 became, it killed millions of people, but it was before they had modern vaccine systems to deal with it, and it faded away. And COVID was certainly an extremely dangerous disease to start with, but it's faded away. But you can't actually, in this case, as in most real-life cases, decide how much of this is a morphic resonance effect, how much of it's because of vaccination. And some countries where they had very little vaccination, it's also faded away. So I'm certainly not a vaccine denier, I had the vaccines myself. I'm certainly not part of a kind of conspiracy theory about vaccines. But I do think morphic resonance has implications for epidemiology of respiratory viruses, as it does in many other areas.
While you were saying all these different ways of measuring morphic resonance, you made me think of possibly another different way to test it. It sounds like a lot of the methods are observing how people are learning, and they take a test over time and they get better at taking that test. But it seems to me, just observing culture and people, that we're actually having like a collective amnesia. We're forgetting to do things that we used to know how to do, like type or read. Now everybody gets their information through videos and quick little videos. They're not reading books anymore. They're not, there's a whole list of things that kids aren't doing that a kid 100 years ago would do. They're not socializing. They're not making eye contact. And it seems like we might be forgetting how to do things. So maybe if kids in America are forgetting how to make eye contact because they're on their phones all day, maybe kids in Tasmania will suddenly struggle to make eye contact. I'm not sure.
Well, morphic resonance would spread bad habits as well as good habits, and it tends to reinforce patterns of behavior that are often repeated. It's about the spread of habits. And I think some of it is actually built into our everyday life. I think a lot of morphic resonance is hiding in plain sight. For example, if you look at the computer keyboard in front of me, the layout of the keys, QWERTY, K-W-E-R-T-Y, the QWERTY layout was developed by Remington Typewriter Company in the 19th century, in the 1860s or 70s. And the reason they developed this layout was because letters that were frequently typed next to each other, if there were bars going to hit the page, if they were near each other, they got jammed. So Q would very rarely appear next to W. So if they'd put QU, it would have got jammed more often than if they put QW. So it was to do with the actual ergonomics of the mechanism of 19th century typewriters with sort of bars going across with the letters on them. So they developed, through trial and error, a keyboard layout that's actually not at all intuitive. If you're learning to type, it's not obvious why it should be QWERTYUIOP on the top row. It's not at all obvious. It would be more logical to have it A, B, C, D. And with the advent of electronic word processors, all the mechanical reasons for this layout on typewriters are no longer valid, because there's no mechanical moving parts in the computer. And interestingly, when computers first came in and word processors, a lot of psychologists tried to develop more rational keyboard systems that would be easier to learn for typing. And, much easier systems, A, B, C, D, or ones that were ergonomically designed to work better with two hands. They used all the principles of ergonomic design. And they tested them out on people who hadn't learned typing before. Obviously, if someone's already learned the QWERTY system, they've got habits, and it's hard to break habits that are already established. And what they found was that actually the QWERTY thing was easier to learn than these new, improved ergonomic designs. Completely counterintuitive, because it shouldn't have been easier to learn. But from the morphic resonance point of view, it makes total sense that millions of people had learned to type using these keyboards with that layout, which made it easier for other people to learn. And so one example of morphic resonance is in front of us every day, every time we look at our computer or our keyboard, in the layout of the letters on the keyboard. So I think there's hundreds of examples of morphic resonance around us all the time. That's what's so frustrating. I can see in front of me evidence for it all the time, but it's a matter of pinning it down in a way that is, conclusive scientifically. That's the difficult bit, which requires special experiments.
Yeah, it seems so hard to test this and isolate it. For one, I'm never going to look at my keyboard the same again now.
Well, it's not that hard to do, actually, to do tests for it. For example, I was talking to someone who developed a music program. It was something to do with jazz, and you could learn to play jazz instruments on the key. You learn to play saxophone and things on the computer. And they had this program that was successful. A lot of people learned it. And each time they brought out a new version, they had to make it harder because people were learning. There was a competitive element. How fast can you learn? And people were just learning quicker and quicker. So they had to make it harder and harder to keep that kind of competitive element of making it hard to learn. So I think a lot of video games are probably showing these morphic resonance effects all the time. The thing is, it's difficult to test in that case because if you have a new video game and you have lots of people learn it, it means that people who've never come across it before should learn it quicker than they might otherwise have done. But the trouble is, video games are now spread all around the world, and so you can't actually isolate people from these things which spread on the internet almost immediately, so everyone can see the new game and learn by watching videos of other people doing it. So it's very hard to tease morphic resonance apart from all these other effects which lead to the acceleration of learning, the acceleration of people acquiring skills in new games, including video games.
Yeah, there's got to be a way to test this through games. And switching gears a little bit, thinking about the extreme materialist worldview that science has taken on, or the institutions, there seems to be an idea going through academia that there is no such thing as free will. And this is a question I've thought a lot about, and I'm curious to get your opinion on, do you think humans have free will?
Well, the simple answer is yes. And I think everyone behaves as if we have free will. I mean, the whole of sort of American individualist worldview is based on choice. Everyone has freedom of choice. They're autonomous, self-determining. Go into an American supermarket and you see 20 feet of different cereal brands, and consumer choice is sort of the whole stuff of modern consumerism, and there's no point in having all that choice. You might as well just have one standardized brand, like they might have done in the Soviet Union, one kind of cornflakes, rather than 20 or 30 kinds of cereal. All that's, and it's based, the whole legal system's based on the assumption we have free will. If you commit some crime, the assumption is you chose to do that and you're responsible for it. It's not a defense in a court of law to say my brain made me do it. So I think, in fact, in practice, we assume it the whole time, the whole of morality, training children, consumer choice, legal system is all based on this, let alone religious assumptions that we have free will, that you have a choice about the way you behave in moral choices. So I think even people who deny it in seminar rooms, in universities, in practice, live their lives as if they have some free choice. So I think it's a totally artificial problem. And the reason the artificial problem arises is because of the mechanistic materialist worldview, which says that everything is determined by physical causes. Everything that happens in your brain is determined by physical causes. Now, in the 19th century, there was an extreme form of determinism. Famously, Laplace, the great French physicist at the beginning of the 19th century, said that if you knew the positions of all the particles in the universe and their motion, you could predict everything that happened in the whole universe, including everyone's behavior, because it was fully determinate. And this wasn't just physicists. In about 1865, T.H. Huxley, who was so-called Darwin's bulldog, who was a very anti-religious, materialist scientist here in Britain, who propagated the evolutionary theory in a particularly aggressive way, he said that if you knew the position of all the particles and their movement and all the laws of nature in the universe, you'd not only be able to predict where all the stars and physical things were, but the exact flora and fauna of the British Isles in 1867, that the whole of evolution would have been completely determinate. Well, that illusion of total predictability and determinism began to melt away with the advent of quantum theory, when it became clear that a lot of physical processes are indeterminate. Quantum theory can only predict in terms of probabilities rather than exactly. And then with the development of chaos theory and complexity theory, it became obvious to many scientists that most things in nature are not predictable. A butterfly flapping its wing in the Amazon could affect climate systems on the other side of the world. Tiny changes could have huge effects that are in practice unpredictable, and because of quantum theory, even in principle, unpredictable. And that's why in real life, most things are unpredictable. I mean, there are people who try and predict the outcome of elections. They often get it wrong. And you could say, well, that's because it's about human beings. But look at the climate. We have huge computers now. We have satellites observing clouds moving all over the place, and enormous amount of data that's fed in. And yet, meteorologists still get it wrong. And if you look at tomorrow's predictions in Britain, where I am, about rain, it doesn't say it will rain or it won't rain. It says there's a 60% probability that it will rain in the part of London where I am. I mean, they don't even pretend that they can give exact predictions. It's all in terms of probability. The way that science is done in testing new drugs and stuff, it's all in terms of statistics and probability. So I don't think that determinism, which is the reason why people thought there was no free will, is a tenable creed anymore. Now, what the materialists would say in response to this is, well, okay, if the movements of particles in the brain and the quantum process are just random, then maybe we can't predict it, but it doesn't prove it's free, because it's just chance what happens. It's unpredictable, but it's just chance. It's not controlled by anything. But that's because they have a reductionist view that the brain is nothing but, and physical processes in general, are sort of bottom-up processes that are based on a kind of granular interactions that have no overall control system. Whereas any theory of free will would have a top-down theory of the way causation works, that there's some overarching causation. I decide to do something. It's me deciding on the basis of some bigger picture, and then smaller, the details appear. I decide to raise my arm, and I raise my arm. All the sort of nerve impulses and muscle cells and ATP molecules get hydrolyzed to make the muscles work. All sorts of physical and molecular details happen, but overarching that is the big picture. I decide to do this. So there has to be some top-down causation. Now, I think the whole way the mind works is through top-down causation, which we've discussed already. I think our brains are influenced by fields, and our minds work through fields. And fields are top-down causes. Magnetic field making iron filings line up around it in particular patterns around a magnet is a top-down cause. The magnetic field isn't just caused by individual iron filings or individual molecules. There's an overall pattern which is shaping their behavior. So I think that free will is about top-down causation. And then, of course, arguments have gone on for centuries about free will. People say, well, you don't know, you're maybe not as free as you'd like to think you are, because there's all sorts of unconscious motives from your habits and unconscious motives working through your mind and other constraints on what you can choose and so on. All that's perfectly true. But nevertheless, I think there's a certain measure of freedom we all have in most of the time, in most of our actions. And I think that's the totally common sense view. I think it's also a perfectly good scientific view. In fact, I think it's the best scientific view, that there are top-down causes and levels of higher level causes. And I mean, all of us are shaped by the culture we grow up in, and cultures have sort of choices that are made over decades or centuries of, whether we live in a democracy depends on debates that happened in the past and political movements that led to democracy, and then whether democracy extended to women having the vote was a big debate in Britain in the 1920s, and there were suffragettes and activist groups, and then Parliament passed a law and women have the vote, and so on. I mean, these things are cultural decisions. Women, however they wanted to vote, couldn't vote one way or the other if they didn't have a vote. But when there's been a cultural decision, there's a higher level thing, a law that changes and a system that changes, within which there's now freedom of choice. So there's always higher levels, there's always other determining factors. But I think basically the common sense view that we have free will is correct, and I don't think anyone honestly seriously doubts it deep down. They may pretend to doubt it, and they can make careers arguing it doesn't exist in seminar rooms, and they may have an ideology that says it's impossible. But in real life, I think most people actually take it for granted.
Wow, that was beautifully explained. Thank you for that. You helped me just make some sense of some things that, I've been thinking about this question for a long time, and I make it a habit to listen to people that are determinists, who say that we don't have free will, and I like to hear their arguments. Their arguments are very logical and well thought out, but the universe is not a logical place, and there's many things that they don't account for. And I love how you just said that free will is this top-down force, whereas determinism is this bottom-up, and that makes perfect sense. I mean, if in this deterministic worldview, there are infinite number of variables that can impact. So like even to test this would be impossible. You'd have to have every particle identical down to if you had two subjects and two tanks and you wanted to see if they could act in this predictable way, you'd have to have every air molecule and everything exactly the same. Because if there was just one molecule that was different, creature in tank A would act different than creature in tank B. And so I think you just beautifully encapsulated that. This quote from Carl Jung, I think, sums that up perfectly, is, "I am not what happened to me, I am what I choose to become." So it's both. You are both the product of your environment, but your environment is also a product of you. And to what degree is your choice.
Well, I think this also shows up in evolutionary theory, you see, because whereas T.H. Huxley thought it was all determined, when quantum theory came in, it became clear that random mutations were truly random, and even neo-Darwinism, which is hardcore materialist in its assumptions, has to admit random mutations and an unpredictability of the evolutionary process. But of course they would say there's no greater plan or design in these mutations, it's just pure chance. But even they have had to give up the idea of total predictability. And I think Jung, saying we're obviously influenced by many factors that act on us, but as Jung says, we have a choice in what we become and what we choose to do. And if that wasn't the case, career guidance, the educational system, the entire democratic system of voting, if we had no real choice in elections, what's the point in having a democracy? Our whole social system would fall apart without it. That's why I say, of course it exists, and I think of it as a completely artificial problem that's just generated by a particularly out-of-date kind of scientific dogmatic worldview.
And one of those things that falls outside of the determinism is psychedelic experiences, because you can have all the predictability and rationality that you want, and then you have a psychedelic experience, and it can be something that many people experience the same thing, and it's something that you can't explain with just this deterministic worldview. What do you think about what's happening when people have psychedelic experiences? Are they reaching into this higher frequency?
Well, actually, I think we don't need to go as far as psychedelic experiences. I think psychedelic experiences are similar in some way to dreams, but they're more intense and more conscious, and we enter them from waking life rather than from sleeping life. But just take dreams, perhaps a less controversial area. Everyone dreams. Most people forget their dreams or forget most of their dreams, but we all have dreams. And our dreams are, on the whole, completely unpredictable. All sorts, every time I dream, things happen which I couldn't possibly have predicted in advance. I can't sit down or lie down at night before I go to bed and write down what I'm going to dream about. Even if I intend to dream about certain things, it doesn't work out that way. So I think we learn about the freedom of invention of our minds through our dreams. Some of them are influenced by memories, some of them are influenced by fears. Some people have recurrent dreams based on recurrent fears. But there's an extraordinary inventiveness in dreams. Our minds can come up with all sorts of scenarios and events and activities and interactions in our dreams that we can't predict. And they seem to have a life of their own. So I think psychedelic experiences take that all further, but I think the dreams themselves can tell us that there's this freedom of the mind to invent and create images, partly based on the past, partly based, as Jung would say, on the collective unconscious, on influences from other minds. And with psychedelic experiences and with dreams, I think what my friend Terence McKenna said is very relevant. They're made of mind, but they're not necessarily made of our mind. There's some mental influences coming into our dreams and our psychedelic experiences, which could be from other people's minds telepathically. Sometimes they're influenced by things that haven't yet happened, by the future, because we can have precognitive dreams. I think they do indeed illustrate the freedom of mind that all of us live within.
I collaborated with Paul Stamets a long time ago, and he talked about in this video that when we take a psychedelic mushroom, we are interfacing with this ancient form of consciousness. I'd like to get your thoughts on that idea.
Well, I'm not sure to what degree we're interfacing with the mind of the mushroom. This is something my son Merlin discusses in his book Entangled Life. I mean, he shows that mushrooms certainly interface with our minds in some ways, psychedelic mushrooms. To what degree we're interfacing with their mind, I just don't know, because it's very hard to know what kind of consciousness a mushroom has. But I think that by morphic resonance, once people have taken mushrooms and had particular experiences under the influence of a mushroom, then by morphic resonance, when the other people take them afterwards, their minds their brains are in a similar state, because the mushrooms affecting the neurotransmitters, the psilocybin and so on, affects the neurotransmitters in a similar way. And they resonate with people who've taken them before. So there'd be a kind of collective mushroom experience we'd tune into. So I think when we take any psychedelic, there's a kind of collective experience that is part of what's happening to us. When people take ayahuasca, which has been used for centuries, maybe millennia, in Amazonian shamanic cultures, when they take it in urban settings and don't necessarily know about Amazonian mythologies, they can have visions of jaguars and serpents and imagery which is common to these Amazonian mythologies, which are not coming from their own personal experience. And I think it's partly tapping into this collective memory of these psychedelic experiences.
Yeah, that made me think of things in our modern culture, like we're very fixated on sharks and dragons and snakes, and it doesn't seem to make much sense. You know, a lot of us live in safe, air-conditioned urban areas where we don't have to worry about snakes or predatory birds, but it seems to be this like fixation of our culture. Dragons or sharks are these predatory animals. And I've always wondered, is this like a resonance from like an ancient memory that's just still resonating?
I think it is. I think, a study on the nightmares of children in New York, which I read some years ago, young children in New York have scary dreams about being chased by monsters and dragons and predatory animals. But these are not the actual dangers that confront a child growing up in New York. They're much more likely to suffer damage from traffic accidents or, being run over by a bus or that sort of thing. That's not what their fearful dreams are about. They're about things that are deeply archetypal. We've grown up with the idea of humans as hunters, hunter-gatherers, but actually humans are fairly defenseless, and humans have also, for much of human history, been hunted by large cats, saber-toothed tigers, and so forth. And, until very recently in parts of India and Africa, people living in remote villages lived in fear, and some still do, of being eaten by tigers or other predatory animals. And the primary victims of these predators are the young and the old. Fully grown, healthy adults have a better chance of escaping by running away. But toddlers can't run away very fast unless they're carried away by grown-ups. And neither can the aged and infirm. And so I think it's interesting that children have these dreams of these predators, scary beasts that will devour them. And of course, they have fairy tales about devouring animals. Little Red Riding Hood, with the big bad wolf that's going to eat her up. We tell children these stories which are actually based on these ancient archetypal images. And I think one reason that children, especially boys, are so fascinated by dinosaurs is that they are these big, dangerous, predatory animals that could eat them up. So they can deal with that fear in real life in the certain knowledge that these animals were scary, but they're now extinct. So in a sense you can look at the fear of these animals, but in a way that's safe because you know they don't exist anymore. They're extinct. So I think these are deep archetypal patterns in our collective memory. And what Jung called archetypes in the collective unconscious, I think are morphic resonance patterns, morphic fields. I mean, I'm saying more or less the same as Jung, but I think morphic resonance provides an explanation for these things, whereas Jung didn't have an explanation for them.
Yes, I heard the idea that a dragon is basically just a combination of all the things that used to hunt our ancient ancestors. It's part predatory cat, part predatory bird, and reptile. And it's all morphed into one. It kind of has like the body of a cat, the wings of a bat, and then the scales of a reptile and the head of a reptile. And those are a combination of everything that used to hunt us back when we were monkeys or primates or whatever.
Well, combine that with breathing fire, and then you have also the danger of wildfires. You know, people who lived in forests or savannas, if there's a wildfire, that was the other great fear. So build that in as well, and you've got dragons with all those characteristics and fire breathing.
Yeah, it makes me think that possibly these things that have captivated our imagination in the modern world might be clues to things that we have forgotten. Like all these superhero movies have superheroes with eyes that shoot laser beams out, or they can move their hands and manipulate matter. And us as the viewer in the movie theater, that doesn't seem to bother us at all. We're like, yep, that makes sense. And so, I don't know, perhaps that is speaking to something that we used to be able to do at a certain time, but we've forgotten.
Oh, well, I think so. Yes, I think movies that are popular and have a big impact are based on these deep-seated archetypes. And in fact, you know, when Joseph Campbell was very famous in the US for his books on mythology, things like The Hero's Journey, a lot of people in Hollywood were reading Joseph Campbell. He had a big influence because he was dealing with fundamental archetypes. And if you build those into blockbuster Hollywood movies, they're going to be very popular because they're actually tuning in to these very deep-seated archetypes.
Yeah, that makes total sense. And then one of my last questions for you is, you said at one point you were a hardcore atheist. And I'm curious to know, like, what has been your journey to get to where you are now?
Well, I started off, my family were Christian, my parents were Methodists, and I was sent to an Anglican boarding school. So I had a regular, normal kind of Christian upbringing, Methodist and Anglican both. But by the time I was about 15, I'd sort of absorbed from my science teachers at school the idea that religion was just a thing of the past and only stupid or simple-minded or ignorant people believed it. And if I wanted to be a smart scientist, then I'd move on beyond all that to science and reason and a kind of materialist worldview. There's nothing but matter in the universe. There's no God out there. God's just a fantasy inside human minds and therefore inside human brains. And so I was converted to the sort of atheist materialist worldview as part of my science education. It was part of a package deal. And by the time I got to Cambridge, where I was studying science, you know, it was more or less taken for granted among the professors and lecturers and fellow students that, you know, if you're a scientist, you're smart. You're smarter than anyone else. And one reason you're smarter than anyone else is you've seen through religion and the way in which people are indoctrinated by priests who are just keeping people in bondage and to serve their own ends and so on. You know, all the standard anti-religious propaganda, you know, what about the Inquisition and so on. So I absorbed all that and thought that was the perfectly normal way to be. Then when I think I was about 26, when I went to Malaysia to work on tropical plants. I had a Royal Society scholarship to go to Malaysia. And on the way there I travelled through India, and this was in 1968. 1968 was a very exciting time to be in India. You know, there were hippies, the hippie trail to India. The Beatles were there, sort of studying with the Maharishi, and so India fascinated me. I sort of saw a whole culture that was based on a kind of spiritual worldview, and the people I met there didn't seem to me stupid and ignorant, but I was just fascinating. They had something that I hadn't come across before. And when I got back to England in around 1970, I took LSD for the first time. And so psychedelics really opened my mind. I mean, psychedelic means mind revealing or psyche revealing. That's what the word means. And it certainly did that for me. And it gave me a sense of the power and nature of consciousness way beyond anything I'd been educated in, either through my childhood religious education or through my scientific education, where I'd learned about nerve impulses and different bits of the brain and stuff, but nothing in my scientific education had prepared me for the side effect of LSD. So that got me interested in consciousness, and then I wanted to explore it in its own right, you know, not necessarily through drugs. So I took up transcendental meditation around 1971 and yoga, and got interested in Indian philosophy. And then in 1974, I had a chance to go and get a job in India, work in India. I worked in an International Agricultural Institute called ICRISAT in Hyderabad. So I resigned my fellowship in Clare College, Cambridge, and took up this job in India, partly because I was interested in doing practical research in a holistic way, and agriculture is much more holistic than reductionist research that I was doing at Cambridge. Partly because I'd just come up with the idea of morphic resonance and didn't really want to go on doing reductionistic biochemistry, I was working in the biochemistry department. And partly because I was fascinated by Indian culture. And so in India I visited temples and ashrams and immersed myself in the kind of Hindu worldview. I also had a Sufi teacher for a couple of years and got into mystical Islam as well. And then, fascinated I was by all this, I realized it was all very exotic and it didn't really fit with my own cultural roots or my own habits of thought. And I was much more deeply embedded in a Christian cultural framework than I had thought. So I started looking again, to my surprise, at the Christian path. I started praying and I started going to church. And I was, at the age of 34, I was confirmed in the Church of South India, which is a mixture of Anglican and Methodist churches, an ecumenical church, which fitted my background. But although I found that, you know, a good path to follow, it didn't have the mystical depth that the Hindu tradition had. And at that stage I came across this wonderful teacher called Father Bede Griffiths, who was a British Benedictine monk living in an ashram in South India, who was deeply immersed in the Upanishads and the Hindu scriptures and the Hindu mysticism. And he opened my eyes to the whole mystical tradition within Christianity. So he acted for me as the perfect bridge between the Western and the Eastern traditions and the Christian and the Hindu and Buddhist traditions. So I found my way back onto a Christian path. And when I very much liked in India the way that there were pilgrimages and holy places and sacred trees and the sense of living nature and all that. And when I got back to England, I realized, well, we've got all these holy places here. We've got churches and cathedrals and places where hermits lived, and we've got holy trees, and we've got sacred wells, and so I rediscovered the whole of this side of my own culture, which I'd completely blanked out before through this kind of atheist propaganda, and found myself drawn back into a Christian path, which is what I've followed ever since. So I'm not a dogmatic Christian in the sense I think everyone ought to become a Christian, but I think for people who come from a Christian cultural and family background, it's the best to examine one's own ancestral tradition first, or at least second or third in my case, but to take it seriously. And it may not work for various reasons, and then there are other traditions we can be up for. But what I found was that many people who'd gone through the materialist worldview and then discovered spirituality still retained a lot of their anti-Christian prejudice, and adopted an attitude that I sometimes, I didn't invent this, but has been summarized as ABC, anything but Christian. So you have, say, a shamanic dream catcher, a statue of the Buddha, some Hindu joss sticks, a kind of mixture, a pick and mix approach, which was characteristic of the New Age movement, a kind of pick and mix approach to spirituality, which fits a kind of individual path. But I think that it's very important to have a community, build community and sustain community. And the advantage of traditional religions is that's what they do. And, a parish church, for example, is for all the people who live in that area. And I go to church on Sundays wherever I am, because I like going to the local sacred place. If I'm in a village, I go to the local village church. And in England, they're usually medieval. They've been there hundreds of years. I like connecting with the holy place. I like connecting with the local community, singing together. If I don't go to church, I don't connect with the local holy place. I don't connect with sacred time. I don't connect with the community. I don't sing with anyone. And if I do that, I feel this sense of connection, which is, for me, sustaining and helpful. And at the end of the service, you get a blessing, and it means I start every week with a blessing. And for me, I just feel much better about living that way. And I meditate every morning. I really believe in yoga and meditation. I do yoga exercises and meditate every morning. And every evening I pray before I go to bed. So I have a kind of daily spiritual practice. And I also believe that following a religious path gives a structure to the year, not only to the week, but the whole year. So right now, it's March when we're talking, and it's Lent. So, I think Lent is a time of breaking habits. So personally, I give up alcohol for Lent. And I fast during the Holy Week, before Easter, for usually 4 or 5 days with no food, just tea and water. Because I find that a very helpful way. It purifies the body, it detoxifies the body, and also makes one not take for granted the food and the normal habits of life. So I find it a really helpful practice, clarifying the mind. So all of these are things that I find very helpful, spiritually helpful, and I find enhance my experience of life and my day-to-day living. And I just find that, if I think back on the kind of materialist, atheist phase of my life, I just missed out on so many things that I now really appreciate. I missed out on connecting with holy places, with tradition, with structuring of the time through the liturgical year, through having blessings, through connecting with communities, through singing with other people. All these things just weren't part of my life, and I find my life richer and more meaningful with all those things.
Wow, that's beautiful and really inspiring. I like how you just went on this journey from place to place and picked up things that you liked spiritually along the way and incorporated them and looked inward and refined your spiritual practice, and then came all the way around to this Christian worldview that you started with. And that deeply resonates with me, because I probably called myself an atheist for a period of time, maybe in my late teens, and thankfully found out early that didn't serve me. And so I came to Eastern philosophies and Eastern teachings because I was like, I'm not going to go back to Christianity. But, I like what you said, it resonates, where I found out that I did have a Christian foundation, and that way it resonates. I keep saying resonate. Yeah, and so I've come back to it, and it fits like a glove, and it feels good, but I'm not strict about it. If meditation helps, that's fine. If I want to visit a temple and pray there, that's fine. I think it's this limiting, restrictive, like infallible, like this strict, rigid system that gets people traumatized and gets people saying, no, I don't want any part of that. But if you strip away all those rules and restrictions, at the core of it, it is this beautiful community that can enrich your life and give you tons of meaning. And I guess if you could give any advice to somebody that is having maybe a crisis of meaning, feeling like their life is empty, or, we have a meaning crisis in America where a lot of people nothing matters anymore. If you could maybe speak to somebody that feels like their life is a bit meaningless, what would you recommend?
Well, I think there are many spiritual practices. My two most recent books are on them: Science and Spiritual Practices and Ways to Go Beyond and Why They Work. And in those books I discuss spiritual practices that anyone can do. I mean, meditation, prayer, singing and chanting, fasting, pilgrimage, connecting with nature, sports as a spiritual practice, learning from animals. I mean, I go through these practices which have scientific investigations which show that these practices on the whole make people healthier, happier, and live longer. I mean, there's a lot of evidence that spiritual practices have measurable effects, generally good effects. So one thing is to take up spiritual practices that suit you. I mean, different people have different ways of being, and not everything works for everyone. It's not one size fits all. So I think spiritual practice is one important part. And it's about experience. It's not about belief. I think one of the problems that atheists have created really is that it's all about belief. You've got to believe these things. And of course Christians themselves have not helped by, in the past there have been these schismatic disputes between different sects who've been all about belief and saying the right thing. I think it's primarily about experience. And when I go to church and meet other people who go to church, and I do this wherever I am. I do it in Britain, in villages, in towns. When I'm in America, I go to usually Episcopalian churches, but if there isn't one, I go to Catholic ones or Methodist ones. When I meet lots of people who are practicing Christians, and for most of them, it's not primarily about belief. It's about the practice. It's about being with other people. It's about community. It's about singing together. It's about the effects of prayer, and the effects of feeling a blessing, of giving thanks, and having a framework for all these things, and of helping other people. And so I think letting go of the idea it's all about belief is an important thing, and seeing it's actually about experience. And if you have this sense of connection with a consciousness or mind greater than yourself, which comes to me spontaneously relatively often, and through prayer and meditation I feel this, on a daily basis, then there's the sense you're part of something bigger than yourself. And I feel this through nature as well, and connecting with nature is enormously helpful. It means you don't feel isolated, alienated, cut off, separated. You feel connected, which is a much better way to feel and to experience life. So I think part of it would be looking at the possibility of spiritual practices, and my own particular guide to these is in these two books of mine. And also, as I say, seeing that it's mostly about experience, not about explicit beliefs, and it's and then just seeing what happens by living in a different kind of way. One thing that's particularly helpful here in Britain, it's harder in America, is pilgrimages. There's a big revival of pilgrimage in Britain to ancient holy places. All over Europe there's a big revival of pilgrimage at the moment, on foot. So walking to a holy place like a great cathedral or a church or a holy well through the countryside is a marvellous practice. That's harder in America because the churches and things are much more recent, and the ancient holy places are Native American, and they wouldn't necessarily want to have lots of people descended from Europeans descending and taking over their sacred places, so it's more problematic. But in America, I think what the main sacred places are really the parks, the national parks and the state parks, which are really the modern equivalent of sacred groves. In the ancient world, in the ancient Christian world and ancient Indian world and so on, they had sacred groves, which were the old parts of the old forest that were never cut down and were left there as an abode for the spirits of the place, and where you could connect with them. In Ethiopia, for example, which has been Christian for nearly 2,000 years, the churches are surrounded by sacred forests, and where no one will cut the trees down or destroy them. They're like nature reserves. They're sacred nature reserves. It's very much Hindu. In India, there are a lot of sacred groves, and if you want to find endangered species or rare plants or animals, you go to the sacred groves because no one's ever destroyed them. And I think that when John Muir had the idea of national parks in the United States, he very explicitly had a spiritual motive for this. He called them nature's cathedrals. So I think in the US, the great sacred places are these wonderful parks, and which are on a bigger scale than sacred groves have ever been in the old world. Indeed, most Americans are aware of these parks, and many people go hiking in them and connect with them. And it's usually seen as a recreational activity. Hiking is just a recreational activity, but I think there's an implicit spiritual dimension. And I think by making that more explicit, the experience can become more satisfying and more rewarding and more inspiring.
That's a great point, because living here on the west coast of America, we don't have very many old buildings, or we don't have anything like a cathedral in the UK. And last time I was out there, when I visited you, I stopped by some cathedrals, and it's just so mind-blowing because we don't have anything like that here. And it just puts you in a different state of consciousness. The second you look at that building and walk inside, it changes you. And I think you're totally right. Like the best thing we have here in America is our national parks. And I live fairly close to Muir Woods, and it's surrounded by a lot of densely populated urban areas, but thank God they made this one area protected. And it is this sanctuary to come visit, and you get to completely remove yourself from the honking and the concrete and the glass, and you kind of just forget about yourself for a bit.
Yes, well, I think there are these wonderful places, and more, as I say, more than in Europe, because it's a bigger country, and luckily people preserve them. And John Muir and Muir Woods are named after John Muir, of course, for a good reason, that he was the visionary who really started this movement. Well, Thoreau tried to start it. Henry David Thoreau thought that every township in New England should preserve like 100 acres of the original forest as a reserve, as a kind of sacred grove. But no one listened to him, so they just logged it all. But I think that is a really major asset of North America. But actually there are cathedrals there, although there aren't as many. I'm actually rather an admirer of cathedrals in North America. In San Francisco, Grace Cathedral is, I find, a wonderful cathedral, and they do what cathedrals do here. They have choral evensong, this beautiful evening service sung by a choir, which is incredibly beautiful. It's not every day like in English cathedrals, but it's several times a week, not just on Sundays, but on weekdays as well. And in New York, there's the Cathedral of St. John the Divine, and then there's that, St. Patrick's Cathedral, the Roman Catholic Cathedral. In Washington, D.C., the National Cathedral. So there are actually great cathedrals in the US, and St. John the Divine is one of the biggest cathedrals in the world. So whenever I am in the US, although they're spread thin and there's only a few places that have them, I try and make the most of it by going to them, and if possible, going to choral evensong, this evening service sung by a choir, which is one of my favourite services and is wonderfully uplifting and beautiful. And they all do it. In New York City, St. Thomas's Fifth Avenue is an Episcopalian church where they do choral evensong almost every day. It's very well endowed, so they have a fantastic choir. So these things do exist in America. You can find them, but you have to look quite hard to find them.
All right, that's motivating. I'm going to make a note to seek them out. But anyways, this has been a fantastic conversation. You've inspired me in many ways. And where can people find more of your work and learn more about you?
Well, I have a website, sheldrake.org, where there's a great deal of information. I mean, all my published scientific papers are there, archives of discussions and dialogues. There's a dialogue section, audio section, where I have over 30 trialogues with Terence McKenna and Ralph Abraham, both sadly no longer with us, and a whole lot of other dialogues. I have a YouTube channel which has dozens, I mean over 100 YouTubes on different subjects. And I'm about to start a Substack, Rupert Sheldrake on Substack, where I'll be having monthly postings of new videos about some of my scientific research, new essays, and a series about spiritual practices based on my works on spiritual practices. So there's a whole lot of new material that's going to start coming out on my Substack page. I've got enormous amounts of stuff I haven't published because I haven't had a platform. So this is going to create a platform, and it should start in April 2025. So there are lots of ways people can... Oh, and I have a podcast channel as well called Navigating Consciousness with Rupert Sheldrake.
That's wonderful. Yeah, and I'm looking forward to our next collaboration animation.
So am I. I very much appreciate the things you've already done, Mark. They're great, and I get a lot of very positive feedback from people about them.
Oh, great. Yeah, it's been a thrill to animate your words, and I think the art and your ideas they marry themselves beautifully together.